My name is Graham Rouse, and this is my story. I was raised in the church. My parents were Christians, and I grew up going to church. We moved around a little bit when I was younger, and then ended up settling in Columbus, Ohio when I was in middle school. And so I actually went to Christian school starting in 6th grade. And so faith was even more a part of sort of my surroundings and my life at that time. I went to Christian middle school, Christian high school. But even at the time, I didn't consider myself a believer. But I also think I did have kind of some legitimate, more intellectual kind of hurdles to faith. It wasn't until after high school that I started hanging out with some musicians. I used to play in bands and stuff, and so some of the guys that I played music with happened to be Christians. And so they would, on Sunday nights, when we'd be hanging out, they would go up to the youth service at a local church in Westerville, a Vineyard Church. And so I would go with them just because that's what everyone was doing. And it was the 90s, so most of the time we'd be sitting out smoking and talking outside the church. And sometimes we'd go into the service for a little bit, and sometimes we wouldn't. And I don't know, through hanging out with them, I started to think, this seems like a good time for me to think seriously about my faith. And as I did that, I felt something stirring in me that felt like I hadn't felt that before. And I remember one night there was a guest speaker, and so I went and sat up at the front kind of by myself and listened to his talk. And I don't even remember what he talked about. I mean, I'm sure it was a gospel-focused message, but I definitely remember at the end, I felt like God speaking to me tonight, and tonight's a night where I'm ready to make a commitment to him. And I remember thinking, no, I can't do it because at the end, he said if anyone he did kind of an altar call, and I remember thinking, I can't do it because everyone will see, and like, it's too much of a thing, and I was sort of against the altar call idea, and he was like, hey, if you're thinking, this is the altar call is not important, or if you're worried about what people are thinking or seeing, don't worry about that. And I was like, man, that's pretty, like he pretty pulled the words right out of my head. And there was a couple other things that I was thinking too, and he just sort of spoke to them one at a time, and I was like, man, if I don't admit that this is God calling me now, then I'm never going to do it. Like, this is very clear. So I did. I went up and received prayer, and my friends ended up, laying hands on me and praying for me, and it was very powerful and it was very real and very cool. So that's what I consider like kind of my conversion to Christ. And this was probably the year after high school, so I was probably like 18. As I was in college, I was living with some guys that weren't students. I was kind of like the only student, and so, hung out with a crew of people that I liked and kind of wanted to impress. And that sort of started a spiral down for me of, getting into partying and getting away from my church friends and sort of spending more time in this community that was, more of a party-focused community. And I can remember pretty clearly it was Halloween night, and there was big Halloween parties that me and my friends were going to. And I remember I went to these parties, and we had spent this money to get a bunch of drugs and party favors and stuff like that. And I remember just being there that night and feeling super empty. And I went home and I went to bed. And I woke up the next morning, and I was supposed to go to my parents for lunch. Coincidentally, my parents lived 10 or 15 minutes up the street. I was down living on OSU campus, and they were up in Worthington. And so I went up there for lunch with them, and I was like, all right, I'm okay, like, no big deal. And I went, and I remember we were sitting around the breakfast table, and I just couldn't hold it together. I just sort of started crying, and my parents, of course, were like, well, what's wrong, and I was like, I can't even go into it, like, things are so bad, like, you wouldn't even believe sort of how bad they are. And I remember my dad said, there's nowhere you can go that's so far that God can't bring you back. And I was like, well, this is real bad, Dad, like, I mean, I just started listing off, like, the troubles, and he's like, just come home. Just come home today. Just move home today. And I was like, well, what about my roommate? He's like, we'll figure that out. Move home. And I was like, okay.